Um, Brilliant. So I'd like to welcome everybody, and in particular Gordon, to the next of the speaker series on Agile. This is a topic very close to my heart, design sprints. Gordon has been a huge advocate and supporter of the STA with a lot of the team at Digital, has helped us get the first design sprints through, working with a number of the project teams, and was very integral to the early days of the volunteer app. So thank you, Gordon, and over to you and all things Digital.
Thank you very much, John. So yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along to listen today. Thanks to the Scottish Tech Army and Joanna for inviting me. And I know that Ahmed had put some work into setting all this up as well. So thanks very much for all that. Today, as Joanna said, we're going to talk about design sprints. Design sprints have been around, I guess, for well over 10 years in their kind of current guise. Doesn't really feel that long ago. I feel like I've done a million of them, but it does kind of feel like it was only yesterday that we were kind of talking about these with a passion that you do when things are absolutely brand new. But they're still a very useful way to kind of shape and structure the innovation process, but surrounding that with some kind of practical constraints, kind of like time boxing and so on. Very, very relevant, I think, still today though, and they continue to connect with a number of current kind of trends and themes. So things like the future of work, obviously, in light of our experiences with lockdowns and remote working and so on, being able to collaborate in a remote way, in a sort of efficient, time-efficient way, and still have a creative process happen. That's going to continue to be really important. I think we would all agree that we're likely to be in a kind of hybrid working mode, whether we have COVID or not. I think people have just adapted to that. And it kind of makes sense that we have processes that allow us to do some of the things that we previously would have done in person remotely. So design sprints have kind of adapted themselves to work in that way very, very effectively. And many organizations use them as a way to kind of collaborate remotely as well as in person. Although I would stress I absolutely love running these sessions in person, and there's nothing better than having an actual blank wall at the start of a week and at the end of it having a fantastic idea fleshed out. The other thing is that, you know, they're great still for the whole kind of sharing of purpose and establishing shared purpose in organizations, working on visions and so on. And increasingly, you know, we hear and see a lot around kind of purpose-led organizations and just how important that is. So design sprints are a really, really good way to establish purpose with a core group at the start of a project or perhaps the start of an organization itself. They're inclusive, they involve a broad range of people, so you get a lot of ideas coming together. People are able to play off each other in what you would call a safe space, I guess. It's all about designing with each other, designing with the user in mind, or perhaps with the user in the sprint itself. So they're absolutely baked into what you design, so it's not for them, it's absolutely with them. And design sprints are inherently a human activity. They're all about people, really. So there's hype around design sprints. It's not the case that they necessarily solve every problem correctly all of the time. And we'll talk a little bit later about when you might want to use design sprints and when actually they might not be the right answer. I think certainly in the early days, I guess everybody jumped on the bandwagon a bit and everybody wanted to do a design sprint, which was probably great from a learning point of view, but they weren't necessarily appropriate for every use case. So we can talk about that. But I think there's three things that hopefully through my talk will come out, and we'll do a little bit of hands-on as well, so that we kind of are living the spirit of doing and not just talking. But there's kind of three things. So the first is that it's a really structured way to do co-creation and to kind of do creativity. It doesn't necessarily solve every creative problem, but it's a pretty good approximation some of the time. The other thing is it's a really good time boxing method. So most organizations, people are kind of time poor and they can't necessarily commit to long and protracted processes, or at least being involved in those all the time. But we know that when you come together, you always get amazing things come out. Everybody always says after a workshop that's been well run and that's been well focused, that's great. I wish we worked that way all the time. So design sprints give us a bit of a taste of that. And they're also a really, really good stakeholder management tool. So they allow us to kind of get beyond presenting to senior management, perhaps for buy-in, just using a PowerPoint deck. You know, it's a way to actually show a team in action, coming up with something that actually gets beyond the PowerPoint, I guess, and kind of works for real, and testing out those ideas, but also showing that as a team, particularly if it's a kind of an interdisciplinary team, maybe with people from different departments in the business, or maybe with, outside kind of facilitation, or, a range of different kind of people in the mix. You're able to show that you can actually deliver something. So it's a bit more than just the PowerPoint deck. So yeah, just very quickly about me. So I'm a kind of technologist by background, but I've worked specifically in strategy and design for the last 10 or so years, I guess. Service design, user research, experience design, quite a range of different projects and organizations, public, private, but a third sector, I guess, with the STA. And then it's everything really from small startups, real kind of micro inception type stuff, through to really big organizations, and how you kind of take UX and design enterprise. So I'm going to talk a bit about design sprints, what they are. Then we'll have a look at working on a problem together if people are kind of up for that. We'll then have a kind of a decision point, I guess, which means I can go back to talking a bit more about some of the practicalities of running design sprints. Or if you're fed up with looking at slides, we can go into a bit more of a Q&A at that point, depending, I guess, really on what comes up, perhaps as we do the practical bit. I'm kind of easy either way, but we can flex as we go. Ask questions as we go, and absolutely feel free to share your own experiences. I know there'll be people on the session here who have done some of this before, or maybe lots of it, maybe more than me, which will be great. It'd be really great to kind of learn off each other as we go. So that's all okay. Yeah, these are just some of the things which I hope you might kind of take away from this. So we'll talk a bit about what a design sprint is, what the kind of value is in doing design sprints, why you should go and lobby stakeholders and other people to actually give you the time to do these things, what they kind of look like, when you should run one, conversely when you shouldn't, the planning around them and what you actually need to do for running a successful design sprint, a few tips and tricks around facilitation, something specifically around remote sprints and kind of how you finish them up. So quite a lot in there. I'll probably flex a little bit as we go, just depending on the kind of feedback that you guys give me in terms of what seems most useful, but that's how we'll kick off. Very, very quickly, and this isn't a sales pitch, but I just want to frame where I kind of come from. So and digital, we're a technology design consultancy across the UK. I'll run through just a couple of slides just so people kind of understand that. But the key thing is, if you want to know anything more about the organization or anything more about what I do, just reach out to me. You can get me on STA Slack, or if you're not on there, you can get me through LinkedIn Messenger. Probably is the best thing. So yeah, we're a rapidly growing organization. This slide is actually relatively recent, but now completely out of date. So I think we're close to 1,500 across the UK. There's more offices now than are shown on that map, and we're into kind of international expansion mode. So growing quite fast and aligned with quite a lot of the initiatives across the UK and across Scotland in terms of people that we're supporting, including the STA. I'm going to fly through these fairly quickly because I don't want to bore you, but the key thing is around capabilities. We have quite a large now and growing user-centered design capability, in which I sit and kind of look after things as they happen in Scotland, but we have that capability across the UK with quite a good client base now in the design space. And yeah, we're on this kind of high growth trajectory, but I think with a really nice vision inside all of that, which is to close the digital skills gap, which again aligns very nicely with the work we've been doing with the STA, who are coming at these things from quite a similar angle, I think. I'm going to start off not really by talking yet about design sprints, but I'm going to frame a little problem, which will probably be the problem which we're going to work on a bit later on. So this is the kind of dream and vision in the very near future, a scarily near future, around 2030 or maybe 2035, depending on what you read. All new vehicles are going to need to be what's called non-internal combustion engine vehicles, ICE vehicles, or non-ICE vehicles rather, so the electric, hydrogen, and so on. So potentially in 9 years from now, you won't be able to buy a car that runs petrol or diesel fuel in the UK. Most new cars, the way things are going, seems to be the case, they're going to be electric. Little or no secondhand market or demand, I guess, for the 32 million legacy vehicles. This is private vehicles, there's vans and business use as well on top of that. But 32 million legacy vehicles that you see on the roads today, essentially getting phased out. So fantastic, clean, green vision, sounds amazing. But if we just kind of stop and think about that for a moment, and take a walk around the streets of Edinburgh. I'm near to Edinburgh just now. You may be somewhere else, but if you just think around the streets where you are, close your eyes, take a walk in your mind, think about the reality of those streets. If you live in a city, I wouldn't be surprised if they're quite narrow, not in the greatest repair, perhaps. Cars are parked on both sides. Now you've got to try and picture every one of those cars needing a charge point. Anybody who doesn't have a suburban driveway is going to have to rely on street parking, where potentially you wouldn't be able to have your own charge point. You'd be reliant on the council. Every road across the city having to be dug up and those charge points put in at curbside. As it stands, we can't even fix potholes. Don't put that in. But every one of those cars is running cabling in front of those pedestrians that you can see walking up the street there. It's a whole new kind of health hazard. Not to mention the scramble for actually getting a working charger. There's an impact on getting to work, getting your kids to school, getting on with your life. Doesn't necessarily fit the mold of the perfect marketing-friendly green car revolution. So this is, in my view, a design challenge, much more than it's a political one. At the moment, I think it's framed as a political thing, but it's really a design challenge. But I think the danger, if we leave it as a political solution, we'll end up with an unworkable mess of spaghetti on our streets. So the practicalities of installing charge points in the UK today are that without your own drive and even fully up-to-date electrics in your home, you're kind of scuppered and you're relying on public charge points. Public charge points, conversely, so this is a little bit of data, which we'll maybe use later when we think about what we're doing with design. Is a bit of conversation on one of the apps that exists, ZapMap it's called. Just full disclosure, I do have an electric car, so this is an issue that's quite close to my heart. So charge points around Livingston Football Club car park, and just some of the conversation that goes on. So the app's quite nice. You can kind of log your experience, if you like, with using the charge point on the Charge Point Scotland network. So you can kind of see some of the conversation that goes on, and this is just a small amount of what goes on. So some of them are vandalized, they're broken, they're not working, they're being hogged by a Corsa. The Corsa sat not charging. These people should have their cards revoked. So you can see there's a bit of aggression going on there as well. Not a lot of love between Ross 1982 and that car. So maybe we need a better way to solve this problem of electric cars by 2030 in the face of these realities of urban planning and our historical cities. So you can kind of guess where this is going. Could a design sprint help us see if we could reframe some of these challenges? So it maybe could, and we can have a look at that. And this, to be honest, is the first time I've attempted to do this. So we will see if it does help. But first of all, I think I'm going to need to tell you what design sprints are all about. So before I do that, I'm going to need to tell you a little bit about design thinking, which I guess is the underlying philosophy around design sprints. So design sprints are a practical way to do design thinking. Design thinking is essentially a thinking style. I mean, there are many ways that you can think. Other alternatives to design thinking might be systems thinking, research thinking, management thinking. They're all completely valid styles. Design thinking is another thinking style which is focused more on making and learning things quick. So one style isn't necessarily right or wrong. Some are clearly of the moment, and design thinking has had, again, like design sprints, has a bit of a bandwagon behind it. But it's important to know really what style you're using at any given point in time and how you can get the best out of that thinking style. So there's no reason thinking styles can't be combined. And in fact, when you're working in cross-functional teams or in a design sprint, it's likely you're going to have people that will gravitate more to a certain thinking style than others. And one of the strengths, I suppose, of running a design sprint is you can bring people together with those different styles, but then get them to focus down on a problem and hopefully get the best of each. But overall, design sprints are trying to utilize a design thinking approach. So design thinking, so there's a kind of a craft side to it. There's a doing part to design. And some of you may have seen a now slightly notorious video that kind of went viral on YouTube by a lady called Natasha Jen, where she kind of puts down design thinking, maybe not design sprints, but it's more about design thinking, for not focusing enough on, designers kind of being craftspeople and actually doing something special with design, and that it isn't something necessarily that everybody can do. That said, there's a flip side to that, which is that there's a whole process around how to do really good design, and this is the kind of thinking side. So there's a mindset. Clearly, there is a mindset, and that's something I think that everybody can learn. And there's a process which clearly we can all learn. I mean, most people are able to figure out a process and kind of follow it. And one of the things that we always say about design sprints when we come into that is that the process of a design sprint, if you just trust it at the start, even though there's a blank wall and everybody's kind of panicking that you've only got 5 days to crack this apparently intractable problem, if you follow the process, it actually leads to usually really good results, I would say. So there's that side of it. So that's the kind of two sides of design thinking. This is kind of the classic definition, I guess, Tim Brand's kind of definition of design thinking, just to unpack it a little bit. So it's, a human-centered approach, probably makes sense to all of us, I guess. And it's also an approach to innovation. So it's about how do we actually figure out novel problems to kind of difficult challenges. And it tries to bring together what the user needs, which is obviously important, but equally we need to get a balance with what technology can do for us, so the opportunity in technology, but potentially also the constraints of technology, and then also what a business organization needs to kind of succeed. So what does that look like? Well, in practice, design thinking in its very pure form is really about it's never about thinking in a planning sense. It's really about looking for new insights and then putting those ideas into action and going through a repeated cycle of doing that with limited planning in between. So in quite a pure sense, you don't do a lot of planning. When we get into looking at how the design sprints work, you realize there is some planning in it. But the idea is not to bog yourself down with protracted planning phases. It's just get on and do it, learn. If it doesn't work, do something different. If it does work, continue. So design thinking is all about a make process. In practice, there are lots of sort of structures and ways that people look at design thinking. In a minute, I'll show you that they essentially all boil down to the same thing. But if you read the kind of literature around design thinking, or if you read blogs and articles, they're often following one of these patterns. So there's the kind of Stanford style of this, where they have a 5-step process. The British Design Council have their double diamond, which goes through this sort of 2-step series of kind of expansions and contractions, which we'll come on to in a moment. And then there's the IDEO version, I guess, which again, it goes back to the quote earlier, where you're bringing together the kind of the human factors, the business factors, and the technical factors, and trying to find the innovation sweet spot in the middle. There are some other slightly more extended versions of this. So the one on the left is kind of bringing together the double diamond with a delivery process where you continue to go through that same design thinking style, but as you get further and further into build, you become more and more locked down into what it is that you're building. So those are just some of the ways that it kind of design thinking is kind of used, and the sort of frameworks that are used. Ultimately, though, it's about how do we get past all this kind of noise and uncertainty, and then through a process of concepts and prototyping and testing, end up with something that's actually clear and focused and people understand what they're working on. The essence of it, though, is this what we call an atom of design thinking, where we talk about diverging around the generation of lots of choices for something, and then we converge on one or more of those choices that we decide based on some criteria would be the right things to pursue. So most design thinking processes break themselves down into stages where you spend a lot of time thinking about ideas and generating a lot of ideas, and then taking those ideas and turning them into something a bit more concrete. So during that divergent phase, it's all about quantity. It's all about really positive thinking, exploring possibilities, not being critical, just kind of putting everything out there, playing off one another, looking for kind of unconventional inspiration. And then as you begin to converge, it becomes more about the quality of those ideas, looking for kind of patterns in the wide range of choices that you've kind of generated, and maybe bring them together. So the kind of techniques that you'd use at that point would be things like affinity sorting and kind of merging ideas together, being more critical perhaps of those ideas until you have something that you want to work on. So that's a kind of whistle stop through design thinking. I will just pause slightly there before I move on, just to see if anybody had any either comments or questions or reflections of their own. And if not, that's absolutely fine.
Thanks, Gordon. There's a nice dip in reference there to some of the sort of theory side of things, as well as the kind of practical.
Yeah, and I'll say that I'll talk a little bit theoretically, I guess, for these first few slides, but then we'll get into something nice and practical. But I think it's quite good just to have the foundation. Mm. Okay, so with a kind of understanding, at least, of what design thinking is, we'll talk about design sprints, which are essentially a kind of practical incarnation of the design thinking process. So a structured step-by-step system for solving big problems as a team, essentially a framework to support that divergent, convergent thinking. So that's really what design sprints are seeking to do. This was the kind of original definition, I guess, that came from the folks at Google Ventures 10 or so years ago. So they were quite prescriptive around, how they were to run. It was to be a 5-day process, validating ideas, solving big challenges through prototyping, and then testing those ideas with customers. So it's a kind of an accelerated process, I guess, for de-risking. If you kind of imagine venture capitalists or anyone who's making an investment, they're looking for ways to de-risk what they're going to invest in. So an organization obviously is similar. It can kind of throw darts at a number of different projects or ideas that it maybe has. Some of them are riskier than others. It's obviously expecting a return on those, whether that be a financial return or a return of some other sort, depending on what kind of organization it is and who it kind of has to serve. But yeah, this was kind of developed out of Google. Jake Napsey has a great book which kind of summarizes all the theory around this. But essentially what it is, at that point in time, they'd been running a number of sprints, and I think distilled down that thinking into a process. I think it was around 150 sprints, from what I recall, that they'd run in order to kind of gather data almost about what was best. So it was a very tried and tested method. It's used by many of the big organizations that do really great product design that we're all used to using, Uber, Apple, and all the rest. So yeah, as I say, I see it as kind of it's almost, at that point, I think it was almost like an investment tool. So it was saying, let's get some people together to figure out what we're going to throw our money at, what's actually worth investing in, and also gave an opportunity, I think, not only to kind of back that horse, but also the riders that are potentially going to be involved in pulling that together. So it allows stakeholders not just to see, some great ideas fleshed out, but they can actually see that process in action and have a warm feeling, hopefully, about the team that's going to be involved in doing it. Do these sprints foster pure creativity? Probably not. Like design thinking, they probably have a fair kind of share of critique, but practically speaking, they're probably a really reasonable compromise for busy people to do creative stuff. So this is just kind of the classic outline, if you like, of how sprints run. So split over a 5-day week typically, and we'll talk later about some other ways that you might run these sprints. So you might look at the first day is typically about understanding your users. So who are they? It's all about generating user needs, context. You might bring to the table kind of competitive reviews and so on. So day one isn't necessarily that you're going to go away and do a huge amount of user research. Typically, you would come into the sprint quite well equipped with that kind of stuff. And you might supplement it and kind of do the analysis perhaps on day one, but a lot of the data you would bring with you. The second day then is around, it's the kind of divergence bit. So if you imagine that divergence convergence model, this is all about looking at the data that you have. You've got your kind of problem that you're going after. So you go really wide at that point, and there are lots of techniques that you can use, to kind of do the ideation. And we'll talk about some of those in a moment. You then go into a kind of a decision-making process. So you agree a framework around how you're going to kind of decide on some of those ideas. Typically what you're doing though is you're using some really quite low fidelity methods like storyboarding and just drawings, really, to kind of bring all of that to life. There are other things you can use as well, but the classic way to do it is that it's on paper. And then you have a process around, it could be as simple as kind of dot voting, but there could be other ways, and there are quite a few frameworks for how you might then decide which of those ideas you want to take forward. Typically, you might end up with a couple of really good ideas out to the back of that, or maybe even just one idea if it really shines. And it might be that you've kind of taken ideas from various people's kind of storyboards or concepts that they've put forward, to kind of come up with an idea that you want to take forward into a little higher fidelity through a prototyping day. And prototypes, again, can take lots of forms. If you have developers in your group, you might be able to mock up some screens if it is a digital thing that you're looking at. But likewise, it could be something that quite a different medium would be more appropriate for kind of prototyping. So there are potentially lots of ways to do that. And then you go into a test mode at the end of the week. So you ensure early in the week that you've basically got people lined up to help you to test that. Could be internal stakeholders or people that are proxying for users. Even better if you can actually get real users to play things off. Going into it, the really core to this is that you have clear design sprint goals. So you need to be in the business of solving a problem of some sort. There's no point in going into it and just saying, what could we do? This isn't a process, I would say, that works very well if you just want to do blue skies thinking, if you just want to come up with something radically new. This isn't necessarily the approach for that. It's where you have a concrete problem and potentially some constraints as well. And you're going to try to solve that problem in the context of the constraints. So yeah, you take the big problem, you've then got this, essentially a problem shared as a problem kind of distributed, maybe not halved if you've got 6 or 7 in the group, it's whatever that divides into. But it helps you to kind of, get a bunch of people looking at the big problem rather than one person sitting in their office somewhere worrying about it. Common in all this, I guess, and this is the same in many things where you want to do a bit of de-risking, is that people feel they don't have time. Of course, the response to that is you don't have time not to. There's opportunity costs in not doing design sprints at the appropriate time. There's some similarity here with spikes, and you can certainly use a design sprint as a way to run a spike as well in the agile process. But if you don't use them, the danger is that you're going to spend months trying to figure out what direction to take. You may launch projects that actually are not really aligned with your vision and so on. And you potentially end up with all the costs around underutilization, where you've got a team that you've maybe staffed up to build something, but then you realize you don't actually know what you really want to build. And you've got developers or technical architects or whatever who are maybe then not appropriately placed to do the work that they want to do. So using design sprints, on the other hand, you get a degree of direction, I guess, in potentially just a week. It's better utilized. You're making use of everybody that you've got through that period, and potentially you get better outcomes with less waste. Are they just brainstorming? Yeah, well, so this is kind of interesting. I guess there are lots of ways, as I said, to do design thinking. Traditional brainstorming can definitely be effective at certain times, and certain projects don't necessarily need design sprints. It does all depend on the challenge a little bit. There are some alternatives to brainstorming which probably get a bit closer to what a design sprint wants to do. So things like brainstorming, which is another way of doing brainstorming, but it's a bit different. There are kind of things like lightning jams that you maybe talked about, or potentially brainstorming with just really good facilitation. So if you only had an afternoon, or if you only had an hour, trying to go through all the stages of a design sprint can be difficult. So there's it's not necessarily the case there's not a place for things like brainstorming, but they do tend to drive rather convergent thinking. And I guess we've all been in these kind of sessions where somebody in the room has the loudest voice, and you all just end up regressing to the mean, as it were. And you end up kind of deferring to whoever you perceive as maybe the most expert in the room. The point of design sprints is that everybody gets to contribute. You get much wider thinking, so you spend a lot more time in that divergent phase before you decide to kind of shoot for something. Everybody gets involved, and you end up at the end of the day with something that's quite concrete, and it takes a bit of that kind of bias and loudest voice problem out of the mix. So they can be used kind of well, everywhere really. I mean, this is all kinds of projects. I've certainly seen them used even down in things like hardware projects and so on. That there's still potentially some use in that, so it's worth thinking about this as being in the toolkit, I guess, in terms of what you can use it for. So when do you need a design sprint? Well, yeah, high stakes things. So where the cost of actually going into build, whatever build means, whether it's digital or non-digital, whether there's going to be a large commitment of time and capital and so on, and you want to de-risk that, design sprints are really great for that. So they're a kind of a spike in that sense. Where you don't potentially have a lot of time, you want to get a really good solution, or at least a good enough solution quickly. Sprints are kind of built for speed. They're built to then move into an agile delivery mode often. So you'll often see that done, that there'll be a design sprint that kind of runs into an initial delivery piece using agile methods. So it is all about speed, or potentially where you're just plain stuck. So again, it's a bit of a spike piece as well, that it can sometimes just invigorate a project. And I've certainly been on long running projects where you've been there for 6 months already and everything's just got a bit stale, and you decide to kind of invigorate at least part of the project through a design sprint, and it's quite good for morale if nothing else. When not to run them, so as I said, if you don't have a proper problem to solve, you end up probably floundering a bit through a design sprint. So I wouldn't recommend it in that situation. If you don't have an understanding of customers, so that day one, as I said, you kind of need to come with a fair amount of research already, and possibly armed with some actual users into that early phase. If you don't have any understanding of your customer, again, you could go down the track of inventing something with no actual use case. And equally, if you don't have any commitment to do a design sprint, then you're probably in trouble as well, because it actually requires people from across the organization to be fully committed. And it's probably time saving in the long run, in that you probably spend a lot less time running around stakeholders and knocking on their doors over a more protracted project if you just get everybody in the room at the start and have a clear sense of vision. So if you don't have the commitment, then you've probably got a problem. So yeah, in essence, this is what we're trying to do. So traditionally, I guess, if you have an idea, you go and you build it, you launch it, you learn from it. That's potentially an expensive process. Design sprints want to short circuit that really. So we take the ideas and we get the data quick. So it's testing prototypes basically as quickly as you can through that 1 week process. So this is what I was going to suggest we do next, although I'll take a couple of questions first, but just to lay things out, and you can tell me whether this is a good idea or if you would rather I proceeded to talk a bit more. But I was going to share a Miro board where I've put one of the canvases, quite a complex canvas actually, that you'd use for the full 1 week thing. But I've also done a simplified version, which I've started to populate with some of the stuff around this electric vehicles challenge, which is one of my pet projects, I think. But I'd really, really like just to get a bit of hive mind onto it, if everybody was willing to chip in, and we'll just kind of go through a few of those stages. We won't get everything done, and that isn't really the intention, but you'll maybe learn something, and I'll hopefully get some freebies. So I'm gonna, what's the best way to do this, John? Or will I just stick this in the chat?
Yeah, I think if you stick a link in the chat, everybody, that should then take you to the Miro. Hopefully you've all seen Miro before, but it might be worth doing a quick intro.
Yeah, okay. I'm trying to see how to get the chat window. Maybe I'll stop my share and then I'll get it. Right, that should be a public link, so I don't think you need to sign up even if you don't have Miro access. But let me know how you go. And if you don't want to do it or can't do it, then feel free just to watch, and I will share the Miro board as well.
Just loading up at the moment. For me, anyway.
I can see a couple of people getting in. just while we're waiting, were there any questions or any thoughts or reflections, or if anybody else has done sprints before, any comments?
It's interesting about that. The bit I always find fun is the brainstorming. So it's a great way to kind of get people thinking freely, but like you say, tends to create more dissent and sort of scatter people than necessarily always pull them together.
Yeah. And you often get little pockets, don't you? Little kind of cliques begin to form. You can kind of see it over the course of an hour or two. Have we got most people onto the board? I can certainly see lots of cursors moving around.
Is anybody having problems getting on? Is probably, even if you don't want to turn your camera on, if you just raise a hand, then we can. No, it looks like
you've got. Share the screen. Sorry, who was that?
It looks like you've got everybody. I will.
All right, great. Yeah. So what I've done on there at the top there is just the classic design sprint from the now very famous book about design sprints laid out. And actually, I've noticed even since last year when I last used this that they've added quite a bit more into it. But essentially, it goes through those stages that we kind of talked through a moment ago, but there's quite a lot more detail on here as well about techniques and tricks. It's almost an education in itself, just going through the canvas. So at the mapping stage, for example, there's a lot of talk about setting the long-term goal. So it's, what do you really want this design sprint not only to achieve, but the kind of the outcomes and the outputs of it to go on and kind of inform, and how you're going to measure all of that. So there's quite a lot in there about kind of KPI generation and OKRs, I guess would be the right term these days. The key bit though for me in this, if you kind of cut through it, is this generation of how might we statements. So the first part of the design thinking process is really about, are we actually looking and tackling the right problem? So this is the bit where you bring in the user research that you have and you structure it. And then you reframe it into these how might we statements. So the how might we statements, it's kind of just a trick with wording in a sense, but you take pain points or traditional kind of pain points that you might have gathered through the research that you've done with users, and then you kind of invert them into a slightly more positive framing. So you ask, how might we actually solve that, or how might we kind of dispense with a constraint or whatever the issue might be. And it's kind of just a psychological trick really that you can then bounce off those in a more positive framing, rather than just getting bogged down with something that's written as a negative. But the key bit in the stage really is that you end up with a set of how might we statements, which you're then going to design against. There's also a stage in here which I didn't talk about before called the map stage. So typically you'll look at the core user journey that you maybe want to try to support, and then you try to map the how might we statements, or the pain points, if you like, but the inverted pain points, onto that process and indicate where people are having problems in the process just now, and figure out how you might fix those things. And they then become the focus for what you're going to take action on. So this, you can probably get the point that this isn't necessarily for absolute blue skies creativity, but it is about creative thinking around problems. So after that, you're moving into, well, they've actually introduced this into the process. So there's a recruitment bit, which I can understand from a practical point of view why they've put this in now, because what can happen is design sprint's very short. So you get to the last day and then you sort of, oh, who's going to test all this? And if you want people to actually come and test it, you kind of need to let them know on the first day that you're going to need them on the Friday. Otherwise, your chances of getting people are kind of slim. So I feel that's a kind of a practical step that's been dropped in, but a useful one, definitely. The exciting bit then is around the kind of the sketching and so on. So you've got the sketching and the decision piece. So there's quite a lot of kind of personal time, I guess, within the sketch stage. So you go away, you spend some time basically looking for inspiration to begin with. And everybody in the team does something called a lightning demo, where you bring your bits of inspiration, your kind of, it's not, at this point, it's nothing to do with a solution. It's just things that have kind of inspired you roughly in this space that we're looking at. It could be, other things that competitors are doing. but equally it could be something really left field, and often it's really good if there are some really left field things in there. And you go through and you kind of present these as to each other as a group, with armed with that information and the user research and the understanding of the how might we statements. You then spend some kind of private time going away and sketching out some ideas. And there are various techniques, some of which are laid out on the canvas here, things like crazy eights, where you basically do some kind of fairly raw sketching on paper, and come up with a bit of a solution for one of these problems. So one of these core kind of user journeys where there are problems to solve, which have been framed as how might we's, you come up with your kind of solution sketches, and you then go into this decision piece where essentially you come up with a gallery of good ideas, and everybody gets to present their good ideas. You can all walk around the gallery. You can begin to generate kind of a heat map on the different ideas that are there by using different colored stickies and so on to indicate the things you really like or you maybe don't like quite so much, and do that kind of critique, if you like. And out of the back of that, you do a bit of kind of voting around it. So you decide which of these ideas you really want to take forward. Hopefully you get a consensus as a group, or you may end up with a couple of ideas potentially. But either way, you end up generating a bit of a storyboard. So you get into some kind of storyboarding. All of this is quite low fidelity. You don't have to be a great artist to really bring all of this to life. There are lots of styles, and most people ultimately seem to quite enjoy going back to being a bit of a big kid and doing a load of drawing. So you go through that process, and then you decide one of those things that you want to take into prototype. At this stage, it's a bit dependent on the composition of the team. And it's nice if you have some people in the team, I guess, who can really help to bring this to life. If you're talking about a digital solution that you're working on, if you've got some front-end developers that can maybe bring a bit of HTML to life, that's potentially really good. But equally, there's some really great tooling out there as well. You can do things in Figma or a whole range of different tools that are potentially clickable and all of that. Another key point though with this is that you will bring a set of hypotheses from the previous stage into this as well. So you've got some things that you want to test for, and that lets you set up the testing and a bit of a simple test strategy really, where you get the small number of people, 3-5 people maybe on the Friday, and you take them through the prototype, or you ask them to play with the prototype and give you the feedback that you want, pretty much live. And then you make some decisions about what you've learned from that, what you want to do, and ultimately it's this choice really, which is we're really confident, let's go and build it, or we actually haven't done quite enough yet, so do we run another sprint? So that's the kind of process, and this canvas is really, really good if you want to run these things remotely. Usually what I do is use something like this. I mean, there's a few on Miro and various other online collaboration tools that you can just drop onto the screen like that. Sometimes there is just too much complexity in some of this, and you might want to just strip bits out, but it's a nice way just to structure it for day one. What I'd done underneath that then, just around EV charging, and I'm conscious that actually we've rattled through time faster than I'd envisaged. I've pre-populated some of this, so feel free to come and have a look. But what I'd kind of suggested that you might want to, in the interest of solving this problem, we might want to get some data from drivers and other people on the road, those pedestrians and so on, various policymakers that are out there maybe as well. We obviously can't do that, so we'll just have to make some assumptions. What I've done is I've framed a few of the how might we's that are probably points that I touched on earlier. So for example, how might we make the charging a safe experience? At the moment, those charge points often exist down the back of alleyways and in very dark car parks. Would you really want to be charging there at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night? I don't know. How might we help to pass the time when charging is slow? So even fast chargers just now take at least 30 minutes. Some of them could take up to 2 hours. That's slightly painful just to sit in your car whilst that's happening. How might we let drivers know which charge points are actually working? So you could drive to one of these charge points with 5 or 10 miles left, and I was going to say in the tank, but that's not right, in the battery. But actually, if you get there and find it's not working or somebody else is using it, then you've got a bit of a problem. How do we keep the streets uncluttered? And also, how do we ensure that parking is actually even available and that somebody else with a non-electric car hasn't ended up parking? So those are the kind of how might we's that we might want to solve. A very simple 3-stage journey for that is that people might want to go and find a charge point. They'd want to park up at that charge point and they'd want to charge their car. And what I've done, just in the spirit of the canvas above, but in a much simpler way, is just to show how those how might we's refer to different points in the journey and where therefore that those kind of pain points are. So what we would typically do after that, assuming we had our testers lined up for later, is we might go and look for a bit of inspiration. So I've pulled just a little bit of a mood board together there for other things that might be kind of inspirational if we're thinking about this challenge. So the one at the tops actually is the plan for George Street, apparently. That's going to be George Street in Edinburgh at some point in time. Completely car-free, complete pedestrian zone, which is kind of interesting.
Excellent, and with the blue sky as well, hopefully.
Yeah, miraculous. And here were just some other things that, you know, are kind of from an inspirational point of view that I'd kind of had in my mind. That's the kind of thing that my wife does there with cable tidies, which I would never ever do. So two very different people. This is something I quite like with, you know, this sort of wireless charging that's coming. So
yeah,
just chuck your stuff on a mat. So it could be a bit of inspiration in that. Somebody pulling a battery out of a car, maybe robots giving us a hand. So that, you know, there's a bit of inspiration there. And typically what we would do during a design sprint is, you know, everybody would have gone away and created a little bit of a mood board like that, and they'd play those ideas back to each other. We would then get into kind of that sketching piece, and then I think the nice bit is you end up in this kind of gallery. But I think realistically we may not have a lot of time to ask everybody to go and do some sketching. If we had another hour, we could do that. I will reveal a couple of ones which my son and I actually did earlier, just to let you critique those. So what I will do is I will let everybody have a look at those and see whether they think they're good ideas.
And if you want to run a follow-up session, Gordon, we could
do that if there's absolutely,
yeah,
if there's appetite. Yeah, if there's appetite. So yeah, I'll leave those up there for people to have a look at. But the process would be, you know, we do a bit of an art gallery here. We critique it. We kind of dot vote on things that we like, and we'll see if we can take the best ideas forward.
Excellent. Becky's already up for the next session. So
I think so. I don't think I should go back to my slides. What I think I should do now is just let people either talk about this electric vehicle charging problem, if that's of interest, or start asking me some questions, and I'll do my best to respond.
Is there any questions from anybody?
I'd have a...
Yeah, hi, Gudrun.
Hi there.
Okay.
So I'm interested in the sort of how you facilitate it and to try and get all voices in, and also in the decision-making process then to actually keep the egos out and the loudest voices, and actually how do you try and pick the best design rather than the most powerful person's design, because that problem would still be there, or
yeah, the problem. So the problem's always there a bit, I suppose, when the person with the loudest voice opens their mouth. The point of this process, though, is that it's very time boxed and it's actually quite procedural. So what it really comes down to is really, really good facilitation. That, you know, you need to get everybody to follow the process. And essentially, when they come in day one, you know, you're gonna go through the process with them, so that they kind of understand what they're signing up for. And you're going to set out quite a lot of kind of rules and regulations at the start, which are all about, we're going to follow the process and you're going to trust the process. And they kind of need to check their titles and, you know, egos and everything at the door, all that kind of stuff. You then go through the process, and at each stage, there's something for everybody to do. So the sketching piece, for example, everybody will go away and they'll get an hour, perhaps longer, but certainly an hour to go away and work up their ideas and bring them back. Everybody will then get a chance to present back their ideas, systematically. So it's quite systematic as a process. It's not the case of, the noisiest person or the most senior person gets to present their stuff and everybody else is just peripheral. It's really a very flat week. when, you know, all of that should be kind of locked out. Things like the voting process as well. I mean, again, it's anonymous, and if you use things like Miro, you can turn on the voting feature, so people can vote that way. So you can't even see who's dragging the, you know, in the old days, even online, you would probably just create some little icons, you know, for red and green dots or whatever. Now with the dot voting capabilities and some of these collaboration tools, you open it up to everyone to do that privately. And then you don't really, there's no comeback in that sense from anybody. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's quite good, because everybody individually gets some time beforehand to organize their ideas and present them, rather than, I think whenever I've done some collaborative work, then you're already starting off as a small group and you have to sort of fight in the small group to get your ideas across, and that's quite there's a lot of group dynamics basically, rather than the best idea winning. So the process you've elaborated on is better, because people get time to just focus on the ideas, and then if you vote on it blind basically, I mean, that's brilliant, then you're really going to select the best ideas, unless everybody votes for their own, but probably not everybody will do that. So
yeah,
I think
but even that you can structure, because you can give each person three votes, or some clear instructions on not voting on their own things, or whatever you want to do.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, sounds good.
Gudrun, it's also worth, you know, we will hope to run a few design sprints. Hopefully I'll persuade Gordon to help us with a few, because when you also get somebody that's very seasoned in this, there are some small nudges and techniques they'll use to keep the voices equal, that are kind of nice takeaways. You know, it is a real art between not being confrontational and kind of managing that dynamics. You know, so it's a fun game. But we definitely found the doing stuff personally and bring it back to the table really helped. And the nice thing with tools like Miro that are online, you can go and have a look in at the time that suits you, if you see what I mean, because not everybody has creative spurts at the same time as well. Oh, there was a message there. Yeah, Stuart's asked if you could keep the Miro link. I think that will just stay open basically.
Yes, I mean, there's nothing confidential on there in any way, so I'll just leave that up.
Brilliant. I think you've got interest in this, Gordon, so we can talk about maybe running a bit of a follow-up, and you can see what ideas you can get.
Yeah, that would be great. If anybody wants to leave anything on the board as well, that's fine. I'll PDF up these slides as well and share them with the group.
Yeah. Stuart's asked if it's a straight vote or a weighted scale value. On the volunteer app, we just did a straight vote, basically. You can probably sometimes over-engineer these things. It's not like a procurement process where you're trying to not have influence and there's not money involved at this stage often. But I don't know what else you think, Gordon.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I would say keep these processes as simple as you can. And if you get, I mean, usually what happens, I would say 80% of the time, you'll get one or two really clearly good ideas, and and everybody kind of agrees that those were the good ideas. It's rare that it's kind of you know, smooth across everything, or if it is, you maybe want to cherry pick some of the best ideas out of different things. And
I'd also say with that, you get some where you'll kind of know it's not quite right yet as well.
Yeah.
So there is a go away and think about certain areas, and often that's reflected with where you haven't really worked out what that screen's going to do. So without the clear purpose, the design starts to lose its focus.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, I mean, the other really exciting bit in the process usually comes when you kind of make your decision on this. So obviously, you know, this is a bit where from a facilitation point of view, you need to take care, because obviously everybody's spent a lot of time on their design, and if they're voted out, they might feel a bit kind of hard done by. But actually, people tend to rally again around the good idea, but fixing the issues in the good idea, as you say, you know, probably isn't all worked out. But once you get into storyboarding, everybody suddenly gets a renewed sort of sense of energy, usually around whichever the good idea is, because they get to contribute to that and fix up some of the problems that weren't sorted out the first time around.
Brilliant. Any more questions? There's a thank you there from Alan as well, Gordon, in case you haven't seen it. Brilliant. Right. Well, it feels like there's a follow-up in true Marvel movie kind of way, where we can do a bit more of the hands-on practical bit if you're available and willing to do that, Gordon.
Of course, yeah, not a problem at all.
We'll leave the board open anyway, guys. But it might be fun if we can do a little mock-up mini sprint. I'm sure we can brand it some way. But thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you very much, Gordon. That was a brilliant session, really informative. If you could share the slides, if you're happy to, that'd be great.
No problem.
And obviously I'll be downloading the recording and sharing it, but you know, really lovely to see everybody. Thank you for joining us. Brilliant.
Thank you.
I will stop recording now.